The spring wind carried the scent of new grass and old debts across the courthouse square in Maple Ridge, where Margaret Hart stood with her hands folded over the small swell beneath her worn calico dress. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the gathered crowd, each word driving deeper into her chest like nails into pine. "What am I bid for the remaining assets of the Hart estate? We have here one Margaret Hart, age 26, schoolteacher, with child, to work off the debt of her deceased husband Thomas Hart. Debt totaling $437, including interest and court fees." Margaret's fingers trembled against the fabric of her dress. The baby kicked against her ribs as if sensing the danger, and she whispered a prayer under her breath. 6 months along and nowhere to go, no family to speak for her, no friends with money enough to bid against the men who saw only profit in her predicament. "I'll start the bidding at $50, called out Jeremiah Creed, the banker who'd held Thomas's note. His eyes held no warmth, only calculation. "She can read and write, teach children, do housework. Worth more than 50, I'd say." Margaret's stomach churned. She'd known this day was coming ever since they'd found Thomas face down in Willow Creek 3 months back, his pockets empty and his gambling debts mounting like storm clouds. The territorial law was clear enough: widows inherited their husbands' debts along with their sorrows. $60, came a voice from the back of the crowd. Margaret craned her neck but couldn't see past the wall of men in dusty hats and worn boots. $75, Creed countered, his voice sharp with annoyance. The mysterious bidder spoke again, his voice carrying a strange gentleness that seemed out of place in the harsh proceedings. $100. A murmur rippled through the crowd. That was more money than most folks in Maple Ridge saw in half a year. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. Who had that kind of money, and what did they want with a pregnant widow? $125, Creed said, his face reddening. He clearly hadn't expected competition. $200, came the calm reply from the back. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. $200 would cover most of Thomas's debt, but it also meant whoever won her would expect every penny's worth of work from her, baby or no baby. She pressed her hand tighter against her belly, feeling the child turn restlessly within her. The auctioneer looked around the square, his gavel raised. $200 going once, going twice. $300, Creed snarled, his composure finally cracking. "And I'll work her till she pays every cent Thomas owed, plus interest." The threat in his voice made Margaret's knees weak. She'd heard the stories about Creed's other debtors, men who'd disappeared into his mining claims up north, women who'd worked themselves to death in his textile mill. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if trying to escape what was coming. $500, the stranger said, his voice cutting through the spring air like a blade through silk. "Cash money, paid in full today." The crowd fell silent. $500 was more than the total debt. More than most folks would see in 2 years of hard work. Margaret's eyes searched desperately for the face behind that voice, but the men in front of her blocked her view. Creed's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. He glanced around the square, clearly weighing whether to bid higher, but the stranger had called his bluff. $500 in cash wasn't something Creed could match, not without risking his own solvency. $500 going once, the auctioneer called, his voice tight with excitement. This was the biggest sale he'd seen all year. Going twice. Sold. The gavel came down with a pop that seemed to echo off the courthouse walls. Margaret's legs gave out. She sank to her knees on the wooden platform, her hands clutching her belly as the reality hit her. She'd been sold like a horse or a plow, and she didn't even know to whom. The crowd began to disperse, men talking in low voices about the unprecedented bidding war they'd just witnessed. Margaret remained on her knees, trembling, until a pair of worn leather boots appeared in her line of vision. "Ma'am?" She looked up slowly, past long legs and clean denim, past a simple cotton shirt and leather vest, to a face that stopped her breath. The man who'd bought her was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with dark hair that needed cutting and kind eyes the color of creek water in summer. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but there was something gentle in his expression that didn't match the hardness she'd expected. "I'm Samuel Garland," he said, extending his hand to help her up. "And I think we need to talk." Margaret stared at his offered hand, afraid to trust it. "You bought me," she whispered. $500. "I bought your debt," he corrected gently. There's a difference, though I reckon the law don't see it that way. His hand remained steady, waiting. Will you let me help you up? We've got things to discuss, and this ain't the place for it. Something in his voice, a quality she couldn't name, made her reach for his hand. His grip was firm but careful, and he helped her to her feet with the same gentleness she might show a frightened animal. My wagon's just over there, he said, nodding toward a sturdy buckboard hitched to two patient mules. I've got a proposition for you, Mrs. Hart, but it ain't what you're thinking. Margaret's hand went instinctively to her throat. What kind of proposition? Samuel Garland studied her face for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth she could bear. The kind that might save your life and that baby's too. But first, let's get you somewhere we can talk proper. He guided her toward the wagon, his hand light on her elbow. Margaret noticed how the crowd parted for him, how men touched their hat brims as he passed. Whoever Samuel Garland was, he commanded respect in Maple Ridge, and that might mean the difference between survival and something far worse. As they reached the wagon, Margaret caught sight of Jeremiah Creed's face across the square. The banker's expression was murderous, his pale eyes promising that this wasn't over. She shivered despite the warm spring sun. Don't worry about him, Samuel said quietly, following her gaze. Creed's all bluster when he can't get his way. He won't bother you while you're under my protection. Protection. The word hung between them like a promise Margaret was afraid to believe. She'd been on her own for 3 months, facing a future that grew bleaker by the day. Now this stranger had paid $500 for her debt and spoke of protection instead of labor, of propositions instead of demands. Samuel helped her into the wagon with careful hands, then climbed up beside her. The mules knew their business and started moving without being told, carrying them away from the courthouse square and the curious stares of the townspeople. Where are we going? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. My place, Samuel said. It's about 5 miles south of town, near Cottonwood Creek. Good land, good water, quiet. He glanced at her sideways. You'll be safe there while we sort things out. The wagon rolled through Maple Ridge's main street, past the general store where Margaret had once bought supplies with Thomas's teaching salary, past the schoolhouse where she'd taught children their letters until her condition became too obvious to ignore. Everything looked the same, but she felt like a different person, no longer a respected teacher but a woman bought and paid for, carrying another man's property in her womb. Why, she asked suddenly. Why did you pay so much? You could have let Creed have me for half that. Samuel was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an old pain. Because I know what it's like to be alone in this world with no one to speak for you. And because Creed would have worked you to death before that baby was born. The simple honesty in his words brought tears to Margaret's eyes. She'd grown used to people looking at her with pity or disgust, their kindness tempered by judgment about her circumstances. Samuel Garland's matter-of-fact compassion was something she hadn't felt since before Thomas died. They rode in comfortable silence as the town fell behind them and the landscape opened into rolling hills dotted with cottonwoods and early spring wildflowers. The afternoon sun warmed Margaret's face, and for the first time in months, she felt something that might have been hope-stirring in her chest. Samuel's homestead came into view as they crested a low hill, a sturdy log cabin with a stone chimney, a well-built barn, corrals that spoke of careful maintenance, and fields that showed the promise of a good growing season. Chickens scratched in the yard, and a milk cow looked up from her grazing as they approached. It's beautiful, Margaret said without thinking. It's home, Samuel replied simply. And it's quiet enough that nobody bothers you unless you want to be bothered. He pulled the wagon up to the cabin and set the brake. Margaret looked around the neat homestead, trying to imagine her place in it. Would she sleep in the barn? Cook and clean in exchange for shelter? The uncertainty sat heavy in her stomach alongside the baby's restless movements. Samuel climbed down and came around to help her, his movements careful and respectful. Mrs. Hart, he said as her feet touched the ground, I want you to understand something before we go any further. I didn't buy you to work you to death or to take advantage of your situation. I bought your debt because I have a proposition that might benefit us both. Margaret nodded, though her throat felt too tight to speak. I'm in need of a wife, Samuel continued, his voice steady but gentle. Not for the usual reasons, I'm past caring about romance or such things. But this homestead is lonely, and there's talk in town about a man my age living alone out here. Folks start to wonder, start to gossip. A married man with a family, though, that's respectable. That's settled. The words hit Margaret like cold water. You want me to marry you? A stranger? I want to offer you a partnership, Samuel corrected. Marriage in name only, for both our benefits. You have a home, protection, help with the baby when it comes. I'd have a wife to quiet the gossips and maybe help with the homestead when you're able. But there'd be no expectations beyond that. You have your own room, your own space. Your own choices. Margaret stared at him, trying to understand. Why would you do that? Why would you tie yourself to another man's widow and child? Samuel's expression grew distant, as if he was looking at something far beyond the horizon. Because I understand what it means to need help and have nowhere to turn. And because this place needs a family, needs children's laughter and a woman's touch. I'm not asking for love, Mrs. Hart. I'm asking for partnership, for mutual benefit, for a chance for both of us to build something worthwhile. The baby kicked hard against Margaret's ribs, as if responding to the conversation. She pressed her hand to the spot, feeling the small life that depended entirely on her decisions. Marriage to a stranger was a risk, but what choice did she have? Creed would have worked her until she collapsed, and there were no other options for a pregnant widow with no family and no money. What about the debt? She asked. $500 is more than Thomas owed. The debt's paid, Samuel said firmly. All of it, plus extra to make sure there are no lingering claims. You'd start fresh, with no obligations except what we agree on between us. Margaret looked around the homestead again, imagining herself hanging laundry on the line stretched between two cottonwoods, imagining her child taking first steps in the safety of the fenced yard. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was life for her and her baby. I need time to think, she said finally. Samuel nodded. Of course. There's a spare room in the cabin, you can stay there while you decide. No obligations, no pressure. Just a safe place to rest and consider your options. He led her toward the cabin, and Margaret was struck by how clean and well-maintained everything was. The porch had been swept recently, the windows were clear, and the door hung straight on its hinges. This was a man who took care of what was his. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a small kitchen area to one side and a table that could seat four. The floor was made of smooth planks that had been swept clean, and sunlight streamed through windows dressed with simple cotton curtains. The spare room's just through there, Samuel said, indicating a door near the back of the cabin. It's got a good bed and a window that looks out toward the creek. You'll find everything you need, water for washing, clean linens, some clothes that might fit you. My sister left them when she moved to California last year. Margaret felt tears threatening again. When had anyone shown her such consideration without expecting something in return? Thank you, she whispered. You don't need to thank me, Samuel said. We're just two people trying to make our way in a hard world. Sometimes that means helping each other. He showed her the room, small but clean, with a bed covered in a colorful quilt and a dresser topped with a pitcher and bowl. The window did indeed look out toward the creek, where cottonwoods were just beginning to show their spring leaves. I'll be working in the barn if you need anything, Samuel said from the doorway. There's food in the kitchen, help yourself to whatever you want. And Mrs. Hart? He paused, his hand on the door frame. Whatever you decide, you're safe here. I give you my word on that. After he left, Margaret sank onto the bed and let the tears come. There were tears of relief, of exhaustion, of grief for the life she'd lost and fear for the one that lay ahead. But underneath it all was something she'd almost forgotten, gratitude. For the first time in months, she wasn't alone. The baby settled quietly in her womb, as if sensing the change from danger to safety. Margaret placed both hands on her belly and whispered a prayer of thanks, then lay back on the soft bed to rest and think about the choice that would determine the rest of her life. Through the window, she could hear Samuel working in the barn, the steady rhythm of his movements mixing with the sound of wind in the cottonwoods and the distant murmur of the creek. It was peaceful here, hopeful in a way that made her chest tight with longing. Maybe, she thought as drowsiness overtook her, partnership could be enough. Maybe this strange, gentleman who'd paid her debt and asked for nothing in return could give her and her child the chance they needed to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. As the sun began to set over Samuel Garland's homestead, Margaret Hart closed her eyes and dreamed of tomorrow. Margaret woke to the sound of rain against the window and the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The bed was too comfortable, the room too peaceful, the sounds too gentle. Then it all came flooding back: the auction, Samuel Garland's surprising bid, his offer of marriage as partnership. She sat up carefully, her hand going to her belly where the baby was already stirring with the dawn. 6.5 months now, and the child seemed to grow heavier each day. Through the window, she could see Samuel moving between the barn and the house, a dark figure against the gray morning light, his hat pulled low against the steady spring rain. The clothes he'd mentioned were laid out on the dresser, a simple brown dress that looked like it would fit over her expanding figure, undergarments that were clean and mended, and a warm shawl. His sister must have been a practical woman, Margaret thought as she dressed. The fabric was sturdy but not coarse, meant for hard work but cut with an eye for comfort. When she emerged from the room, Samuel was setting a plate of eggs and biscuits on the table. He looked up as she approached, his creek-water eyes taking in her appearance with the same careful gentleness she'd noticed the day before. "Morning, Mrs. Hart. I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Margaret admitted, settling into the chair he'd pulled out for her. "Thank you for the clothes. They fit perfectly." "Sarah always was good at judging such things," Samuel said, pouring coffee into a cup and setting it beside her plate. "She said a woman needed clothes that let her move and work without fussing about." Margaret took a sip of the coffee and nearly sighed with pleasure. It was real coffee, not the chicory substitute she'd been drinking since Thomas's debts started mounting. "Your sister sounds like a wise woman." She was. Still is, I reckon, out there in California with her husband and 3 young ones. Samuel settled into the chair across from her with his own plate. "She tried to get me to come west with them, said there was no future for a single man in Kansas Territory. But this place is in my blood now. Can't see myself anywhere else." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the rain drumming steadily on the roof. Margaret found herself studying Samuel's face in the morning light, the weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors, the careful way he moved as if he was always thinking before acting, the small scar along his jawline that suggested he hadn't lived an easy life. There was something about him that made her feel safe, though she couldn't put her finger on what it was. "I've been thinking about your offer," she said finally, setting down her fork. Samuel nodded but didn't speak, waiting for her to continue. It was another thing she was coming to appreciate about him: he didn't rush her or press for answers. He simply made space for her words and waited. "I don't understand why you'd tie yourself to a woman carrying another man's child," Margaret continued. "Surely there are unmarried women in town who'd make better wives, women without complications." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. When he spoke, his voice carried that same old pain she'd heard the day before. "I was married once, Mrs. Hart. My wife Emma and we tried for years to have children. Lost 3 babies before they could draw breath, and the last one took Emma with it. That was 5 years ago." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "No reason you should," Samuel said simply. "But it taught me something about what matters and what doesn't. A child is a blessing, no matter how it comes to you. And a woman who's willing to fight for her baby's future, that's the kind of person I'd be honored to call partner." The sincerity in his voice made Margaret's eyes blur with tears. She'd grown so used to people looking at her with judgment, seeing her pregnancy as evidence of shame or failure. To hear it called a blessing was almost more than she could bear. "There's something else you should know," Samuel continued, his voice growing careful, "about why I'm really making this offer. It's not just about needing a wife to quiet the gossips, though that's part of it. There are men in this territory who've been watching my land, waiting for a chance to claim it. A single man with no family is vulnerable in ways a married man with children isn't. The law protects families different than it protects individuals." Margaret set down her coffee cup, understanding beginning to dawn. "Someone's trying to take your homestead?" "Not directly, not yet. But Jeremiah Creed's been sniffing around, asking questions about my deed, my water rights, whether I've got family to inherit if something happens to me." Samuel's jaw tightened. He's got plans for this valley, and a lone rancher stands in his way. The pieces began falling into place. That's why he bid so high for me yesterday. It wasn't just about the debt. Partly, Samuel agreed. But also because he knew I'd bid against him. He was testing how much I was willing to spend, how far I'd go. Now he knows I've got money put aside, and that makes me more of a threat to whatever he's planning. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. So by marrying you, I'd be putting myself between you and Creed. You'd be putting yourself under my protection, Samuel corrected. But yes, there'd be risks. I won't lie about that. Creed's not a man who gives up easy, and he's got connections in territorial government that I don't have. The baby kicked hard against Margaret's ribs, as if responding to the tension in her voice. She rubbed the spot absently, thinking about choices and consequences. Yesterday she'd been facing certain hardship under Creed's control. Today she was being offered partnership with a man who spoke honestly about dangers but also promised protection. "What exactly are you asking of me?" she said finally. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady on hers. "Marriage in name, partnership in truth. You'd help with the household tasks when you're able, maybe teach reading and writing to any children in the valley whose parents want them educated. I provide for you and the baby, protect you both, help raise the child as my own. In return, we present a united front against anyone who thinks they can push us around. And after the baby comes? We'll take it as it comes," Samuel said. "Maybe in time we'll build something deeper than partnership. Maybe we won't. But either way, you and the child would have a home here for as long as you want it." Margaret stood and walked to the window, watching the rain fall on the neat farmyard. She could imagine herself here, hanging laundry between the cottonwoods, teaching her child to gather eggs from the henhouse, maybe even helping Samuel with the crops when harvest time came. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was a life, a real one, with purpose and dignity. "There's something I need to tell you," she said without turning around. "About Thomas, about how he died." She heard Samuel's chair creak as he leaned forward, but he didn't speak. "The official story is that he fell into Willow Creek and drowned. But that's not what happened." Margaret's voice grew thick with old grief and newer guilt. Thomas had been gambling again, deeper than ever before. He owed money to men who don't take kindly to unpaid debts. The night he died, he came home talking wild about a big game, a chance to win back everything he'd lost. The rain seemed to grow heavier, drumming against the window like fingers tapping impatiently. I begged him not to go. Told him about the baby, about how we needed to think about the future instead of chasing after the past. But he was already lost to the fever, you know? That need to win just one more hand, to prove he was smarter than the cards. Margaret's voice broke slightly. They found him in the creek the next morning, but his pockets were empty and there were bruises on his arms that the sheriff said came from the rocks. "You think someone killed him," Samuel said quietly. "I think someone taught him a lesson that went too far. And I think whoever did it made sure to clean out his pockets before they dumped him in the water." Margaret finally turned from the window, her face streaked with tears. "So you see, Mr. Garland, I'm not just a pregnant widow with debts. I'm the widow of a man who died because he couldn't stop gambling, and there might be people out there who think I know more about his last night than I do." Samuel was quiet for a long time, studying her face with those careful eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "Does that change anything about what I'm offering? Does it make you less deserving of protection, less worthy of a chance to start over?" Margaret stared at him, hardly believing what she was hearing. "It doesn't bother you? The scandal, the possibility that I might bring trouble to your door?" "Mrs. Hart," Samuel said, standing and walking over to her, "trouble's already at my door. Has been since the day Creed decided he wanted this valley for himself. Adding your troubles to mine doesn't make the load much heavier, and it gives us both a better chance of carrying it." He stopped just close enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes, the steady strength that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a well-banked fire. "Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I've got a feeling you're stronger than you know. A woman who'd stand up on that auction block and face down a crowd of men with nothing but courage and dignity, that's not someone who breaks easy." The compliment hit Margaret like a physical blow. When had anyone seen strength in her instead of weakness, courage instead of desperation? The tears came harder now, but they were different tears, tears of relief and gratitude and something that might have been hope. "I'll do it," she whispered. "I'll marry you, if you're sure it's what you want." Samuel nodded slowly. "I'm sure. But I want you to understand, this partnership, it's got to be built on truth between us. No secrets, no holding back when trouble comes calling. We face whatever's coming together, or we don't face it at all." "Together," Margaret repeated, testing the word on her tongue. She'd been alone for so long that the concept felt foreign, but not unwelcome. "There's one more thing," Samuel said, his voice growing careful again. "We'll need to get married soon, before word gets around about the auction and people start asking questions. A quick ceremony, maybe this Sunday after church services. Pastor Williams won't ask too many questions if I tell him it's urgent." Margaret felt her cheeks heat. "People will talk anyway. About the timing, about the baby." "Let them talk," Samuel said firmly. "By the time the gossip dies down, we'll be an established family. And once that baby comes and people see how we care for each other, they'll forget about the circumstances that brought us together." The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Margaret gasped slightly at the strength of it. Samuel's eyes immediately went to her belly, concern flickering across his face. "Are you all right? Is it time?" No, Margaret said, managing a shaky laugh. "The baby's just active today. It's not due for another 2.5 months. She looked down at her rounded belly, then back up at Samuel. "But you should know, when the time comes, it's going to be difficult. I'm small, and this baby feels large. There might be complications." Samuel's expression grew serious. "We'll deal with that when we come to it. Mrs. Hensley in town delivered all of Sarah's babies. She's got good hands and a calm head. And if we need to send for a real doctor from Topeka, we'll do that too." The casual way he included himself in the baby's future, the matter-of-fact planning for difficulties that might arise, struck Margaret with unexpected force. This man was truly offering to take on not just her, but all the risks and responsibilities that came with her. "Why," she asked again, the question that had been haunting her since the auction. "Why are you willing to do this for a stranger?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, looking out at the rain-soaked landscape beyond the window. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief and hard-won wisdom. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything and have nobody to turn to. Because I've learned that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose, not the ones you're born into. And because—" He paused, then met her eyes directly. "Because I think maybe we can save each other, Mrs. Hart. Maybe we can build something good out of all the broken pieces we're both carrying." The honesty in his words took Margaret's breath away. She'd expected practical arrangements, mutual benefit, the kind of cold partnership that made sense on paper. Instead, Samuel Garland was offering something much more dangerous and much more precious, the possibility of genuine care, of two damaged people helping each other heal. "Margaret," she said suddenly, "if we're going to be married, you should call me Margaret." Samuel smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, making him look younger and less careworn. "Margaret," he repeated, as if testing how her name felt in his mouth. "And you can call me Sam, if you want. Samuel always sounds too formal for everyday use." "Sam," Margaret said, and found that she liked the way it sounded. Simple, honest, trustworthy. Like the man himself. The rain began to slacken, and pale sunlight started to break through the clouds. Margaret could see steam rising from the wet earth, and the cottonwoods seemed to shimmer with new life. It felt like a sign, a promise that maybe this strange partnership could grow into something beautiful. "So," Sam said, his voice lighter now that they'd reached their understanding. "Sunday morning, after church services. Pastor Williams can marry us in the vestry, with Mrs. Williams and whoever else is around as witnesses. Nothing fancy, just the legal words that'll make it official." Margaret nodded, her heart racing at how quickly her life was changing. 3 days ago she'd been facing destitution and possibly death in childbirth. Now she was planning a wedding to a man who promised partnership and protection, who spoke of her unborn child as a blessing instead of a burden. "I should warn you," she said, trying to keep her tone light, "I'm not much of a cook. Thomas always said my biscuits could be used as building materials." Sam's laugh was warm and genuine. Well, you're in luck. I do most of my own cooking, and I make passable biscuits. We'll figure out the rest as we go. As the sun broke fully through the clouds, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months, anticipation for the future instead of dread. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was partnership freely chosen, respect freely given, and hope carefully nurtured. Outside, the world was washed clean by the rain, ready for new growth. Inside the cabin that would soon be her home, Margaret Hart prepared to become Margaret Garland, ready to build a life from the ashes of her old one day at a time. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made everything seem possible. Margaret stood before the small mirror in her room, trying to pin her hair into something resembling respectability with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The brown dress Sam's sister had left behind was clean and pressed, but it couldn't disguise the pronounced swell of her belly or the pallor that came from months of worry and poor eating. "You look fine," she whispered to her reflection, though her voice lacked conviction. In 3 hours, she would be Mrs. Samuel Garland, bound by law and custom to a man she'd known for less than a week. The rational part of her mind insisted this was madness, but the growing child in her womb reminded her that madness might be her only path to survival. Sam knocked softly on her door. "Margaret?" "The wagon's ready when you are." She opened the door to find him dressed in his Sunday best, a black suit that had seen better days but was clean and well-mended, a white shirt with a string tie, and boots polished to a dull shine. His dark hair was slicked back with water, and he'd shaved so carefully that she could see a small nick along his jawline where the razor had slipped. "You look very handsome," she said, meaning it. "And you look beautiful," he replied, his creek water eye steady on hers. "Are you ready for this?" Margaret nodded, though her stomach was churning with more than just a baby's movements. "As ready as I can be." The ride to town passed in companionable silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Margaret found herself studying the familiar landscape as if seeing it for the last time, the rolling hills dotted with wildflowers, the creek that wound like a silver ribbon through the valley, the scattered homesteads where smoke was already rising from breakfast fires. By evening, she would be looking at all of this as home instead of exile. Maple Ridge was busier than usual for a Sunday morning, with families in their church clothes heading toward the white-steepled building at the end of Main Street. Margaret noticed how people's heads turned as Sam's wagon passed, how conversations stopped mid-sentence and resumed in urgent whispers once they'd gone by. Word of the auction had spread, as she'd known it would. "Let them stare," Sam said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "By next Sunday, we'll be old news." Pastor Williams was waiting for them in the church vestry, a small room behind the altar that smelled of candle wax and old hymn books. He was a thin man with kind eyes and work-worn hands, the sort of frontier preacher who was as comfortable birthing calves as delivering sermons. His wife Martha stood beside him, her graying hair pinned back severely but her face gentle with understanding. "Samuel," the pastor said, extending his hand. "And this must be Mrs. Hart." He took Margaret's hand carefully, his grip warm and reassuring. "Martha's told me a bit about your circumstances. I want you to know that whatever brought you to this moment, you're starting fresh from here." The simple acceptance in his words nearly undid Margaret's composure. She'd expected judgment, questions about the propriety of such a hasty marriage. Instead, she found only kindness. "Thank you, Pastor Williams," she managed. "That means more than you know." Martha Williams stepped forward, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Every bride should have flowers," she said simply, pressing them into Margaret's hands. "I picked these from our garden this morning." The flowers were simple, black-eyed Susans and prairie roses, wild mint and sage, but they were beautiful in their unstudied naturalness. Margaret held them to her nose, breathing in the sweet scent of new beginnings. "Now then," Pastor Williams said, opening his worn Bible. "Let's begin." The ceremony was brief and simple, the words familiar from countless weddings Margaret had attended over the years. But hearing them spoken over herself, feeling Sam's steady presence beside her as they promised to honor and care for each other, made them feel entirely new. When Sam slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, his mother's ring, he explained quietly, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening onto possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine. "You may kiss your bride," Pastor Williams said with a gentle smile. Sam turned to her, his eyes questioning. Margaret nodded slightly, and he leaned down to brush his lips against hers, a kiss as gentle and respectful as everything else about him, but with an underlying warmth that made her pulse quicken. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Garland," Martha Williams said, embracing them both. "May your marriage be blessed with many years of happiness." As they emerged from the vestry, Margaret noticed that the church service was just ending, and the congregation was filing out into the bright morning sun. She felt every eye turned toward them, saw the whispered conversations that started the moment people recognized who was walking beside Sam. "Samuel Garland." Jeremiah Creed's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. The banker pushed through the crowd, his pale eyes fixed on Margaret with unmistakable malice. "Fancy seeing you here this morning. And with your new acquisition." Sam's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Morning, Creed. I'd like you to meet my wife, Margaret." The word wife seemed to hit Creed like a physical blow. His face flushed red above his starched collar, and Margaret could see the calculations running behind his eyes. A married woman had legal protections that a bonded servant didn't. A woman with a husband's backing couldn't be worked to death or disposed of quietly. "Your wife," Creed repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "How remarkably convenient. And how remarkably quick. One might wonder what sort of woman agrees to marry a stranger after being sold like livestock." The insult hung in the air between them, and Margaret felt Sam's entire body go rigid beside her. Several of the churchgoers had stopped to listen, their faces avid with curiosity and scandal. "The sort of woman," Sam said, his voice deadly quiet, "who has more courage and dignity in her little finger than you have in your entire body. The sort of woman who deserves respect, not the kind of treatment you had planned for her." Creed's smile was cold and predatory. "Oh, I'm sure she deserves exactly what she gets. After all, we all know what sort of woman finds herself in such circumstances. A gambling man's widow, carrying another man's bastard, with debts that need paying. Tell me, Samuel, what exactly did you get for your $500? The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the promise of confrontation. Margaret could see faces she recognized, former students, their parents, shopkeepers who'd once greeted her respectfully on the street. Now they watched with the hungry fascination people reserved for watching someone else's downfall. Sam took a step forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his hip where a gun would hang if he were armed. "I got a wife," he said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the gathered crowd. "A woman of character and strength who's been dealt a hard hand by life but hasn't let it break her spirit. A woman who's going to help me build something worthwhile on my land, who's going to be a mother to the child she carries and maybe to other children too. What I got, Creed, is more than a man like you could ever understand." The public declaration of his faith in her hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd expected tolerance, perhaps even kindness, but not this fierce protection, this public claiming that went far beyond their private agreement. Creed's face grew uglier. "Pretty words. But we both know the truth, don't we? You bought yourself a whore and her bastard, and now you're trying to dress it up as respectability. How long do you think that's going to last when reality sets in?" The words whore cracked across the morning air like a whip, and Margaret felt something inside her snap. She'd endured months of whispered insults, months of being treated like damaged goods, months of keeping her head down and accepting whatever scraps of dignity people were willing to throw her. But she was Mrs. Samuel Garland now, and she would not let this man destroy her husband's reputation with his poison. "Mr. Creed," she said, stepping forward before Sam could respond. Her voice was clear and carrying, pitched to reach every listening ear. "I'm curious about something. You bid on me at that auction, didn't you? Bid quite enthusiastically, from what I recall. Now, if I'm what you say I am, what does that make you? A man willing to pay good money for a whore and her bastard?" The crowd stirred at her words, some shocked by her boldness, others beginning to see the trap she'd laid. Creed's face went from red to purple, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "Furthermore," Margaret continued, her schoolteacher's voice carrying easily across the churchyard, "you've just insulted every person here who attended my wedding. Pastor Williams, who married us. Mrs. Williams, who gave me flowers. All these good Christian people who witnessed our vows. Are you saying they're all fools? That they can't tell the difference between a proper marriage and whatever ugly thing exists in your imagination? The murmur from the crowd had shifted, and Margaret could see that public opinion was beginning to turn. Creed had overplayed his hand, revealed too much of his own nastiness. In trying to destroy her reputation, he'd made himself look petty and vindictive. Pastor Williams stepped forward, his usually gentle face stern with disapproval. "Mr. Creed, I think you've said enough. This is the Lord's day, and these are church grounds. If you can't speak with Christian charity, perhaps it's best you don't speak at all. Besides," added Mrs. Hensley, the midwife who delivered half the babies in Maple Ridge, "seems to me a man who'd stand up at auction and pay $500 to protect a woman and her unborn child is showing more Christian virtue than one who'd bid on her to work her to death." Other voices began to join in, and Margaret realized with amazement that the tide of opinion was turning in their favor. Sam's reputation in the community, his years of honest dealing and hard work, carried weight that Creed's money couldn't buy. "This isn't over," Creed snarled, his composure finally cracking completely. "You think one little ceremony changes anything? You think a piece of paper makes you respectable? I know what you are, and I know what he is. A man who'd marry damaged goods is damaged himself." Sam moved then, faster than Margaret would have thought possible. One moment he was standing beside her, the next he was inches from Creed's face, his voice so low and dangerous that only those closest could hear. "If you ever speak about my wife that way again," he said, each word precise and deadly, "if you ever look at her with anything but respect, if you so much as mention her name without cause, I will forget that we're standing on church grounds and remind you why smart men don't push Samuel Garland too far." The threat was quiet but unmistakable, and Creed seemed to shrink visibly under Sam's stare. Margaret realized in that moment that her husband was not just a gentle farmer. There was steel in him, tempered by years of frontier life and sharpened by the need to protect what was his. Creed looked around the crowd, perhaps hoping for support, but found only disapproving faces and hostile stares. Whatever power he thought his money gave him, it wasn't enough to overcome the community's growing disgust with his behavior. "We'll see," he muttered finally, backing away. "We'll just see how long this fairy tale lasts." He pushed through the crowd and stalked away, leaving behind a buzz of conversation and speculation. Margaret felt her knees go weak as the confrontation ended, and Sam was immediately at her side, his arm steadying her. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, his eyes searching her face for signs of distress. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice shook slightly. I've never stood up to someone like that before." "You were magnificent," Sam said, and the pride in his voice made her heart skip. "Absolutely magnificent. You turned his own words against him and made him look like the petty fool he is." Pastor Williams approached him, his face concerned. "I'm sorry about that display. Creed's been growing more bitter and difficult lately, but I've never seen him be quite so vindictive." "It's not your fault, Pastor," Sam said. "He's been looking for an excuse to cause trouble for months. Today just gave him the opening he thought he wanted." "Well, he certainly didn't get what he expected," Mrs. Williams said with satisfaction. "That was as fine a piece of rhetoric as I've heard in years, Mrs. Garland. You've got the makings of a preacher yourself." The use of her new name sent a little thrill through Margaret. Mrs. Garland. She was no longer Margaret Hart, the gambling man's pregnant widow. She was Margaret Garland, with a husband who'd stood up for her in public and a community that was beginning to see her as more than her circumstances. As they made their way back to the wagon, people approached them with congratulations and well wishes. Margaret was surprised by the warmth she received, the genuine acceptance that seemed to grow stronger in the aftermath of Creed's ugly display. "Mrs. Garland," called Mrs. Hensley, catching up to them as they reached the wagon. "I wanted to tell you, when your time comes, you send Sam for me right away. I've delivered more babies than I can count, and I've yet to lose a mother or child to complications that couldn't be handled with steady hands and common sense." The offer of professional help when the baby came was another weight off Margaret's shoulders. She'd been dreading the prospect of facing childbirth alone, with only Sam's inexperienced assistance. Having the town's respected midwife offer her services was both a practical blessing and a sign of social acceptance. "Thank you," Margaret said, tears threatening again. "That means everything to me." As they drove out of town, Margaret noticed that Sam kept checking behind them, his eyes alert for any sign of trouble. The confrontation with Creed had been a victory of sorts, but it had also made their enemies' intentions clear. This was far from over. He's not going to let this go, is he? Margaret said as the town fell behind them. No, Sam said simply. He's not. But he's also not as strong as he thinks he is. That display back there cost him respect in the community, and respect is worth more than money out here. People saw what kind of man he really is. And what kind of woman I am, apparently, Margaret said, still amazed at her own boldness. Sam smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him all day. The kind of woman who can hold her own in a fight and make her husband proud. The kind of woman who's going to help me build something that'll last. As they drove back toward the homestead that was now officially their home, Margaret felt the baby settling quietly in her womb, as if sensing that the immediate danger had passed. The confrontation with Creed had been frightening, but it had also been liberating. She was no longer hiding, no longer accepting whatever treatment people chose to give her. She was Margaret Garland now, with a husband who'd fight for her and a community that was beginning to see her worth. The afternoon sun warmed her face as they turned up the familiar track toward home, and for the first time since Thomas's death, Margaret allowed herself to believe that she might actually have a future worth fighting for. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't face them alone. She had a partner now, a real one, and together they might just be strong enough to build the life they both deserved. The cabin came into view as they crested the small rise, its windows golden with reflected sunlight, the barn and corral speaking of prosperity and careful stewardship. Home, Margaret thought with wonder. This was home now, hers to protect and nurture and fill with the laughter of children. As Sam helped her down from the wagon, she felt the baby kick strongly against her ribs, as if celebrating this new beginning. 3 months to go before the child arrived, 3 months to prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Margaret Garland was looking forward to the future instead of dreading it. The summer months passed in a rhythm of work and quiet contentment that Margaret had never imagined possible. She rose each morning to the sound of Sam moving about the kitchen, preparing coffee and checking on the animals before the heat of the day set in. By the time she emerged from her room, there would be fresh eggs on the table, milk cooling in the spring house, and the easy companionship of a man who asked nothing more of her than she was able to give. Her belly grew round and heavy as the corn ripened in Sam's fields. By August, she could barely see her feet, and simple tasks like hanging laundry or gathering vegetables from the garden left her breathless and tired. But Sam never complained about the work she couldn't do, never made her feel like a burden. Instead, he seemed to take genuine pleasure in caring for her, bringing her cool water when the heat grew oppressive, rubbing her aching back in the evenings when the baby's weight made sleep difficult. "You don't have to do all this," she told him one evening in late August as he massaged her swollen feet. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the air finally beginning to cool after another scorching day. "Do what?" Sam asked, his hands gentle but sure as they worked out the knots of tension. "Take care of me like this. I know this wasn't what you bargained for when you made your offer." Sam was quiet for a moment, his hands stilling on her feet. When he looked up at her, his creek-water eyes were serious. "Margaret, what I bargained for was a partnership. That means taking care of each other, whatever that looks like from day to day. Right now, you're growing our child and that's work enough for any woman." The casual way he said our child never failed to make Margaret's heart skip. In the 4 months since their wedding, Sam had never once referred to the baby as anything other than theirs. He'd built a cradle with his own hands, carved toys from scraps of wood, and spent hours talking to her belly when he thought she was asleep, telling the unborn child stories about the farm and the animals and the life they'd have together. "I worry sometimes," Margaret said softly, "about what will happen when the baby comes. If there are complications, if something goes wrong. Then we'll face it together," Sam said firmly. "Mrs. Hensley's delivered more babies than anyone in 3 counties, and if we need to send for the doctor from Topeka, we'll do that too. But I've got a feeling this baby's going to be just fine. Strong and healthy, like its mother." As if responding to his words, the baby kicked hard against Margaret's ribs, making both of them laugh. The child had grown increasingly active as the due date approached, seeming to dance to music only it could hear. "Speaking of Mrs. Hensley," Sam continued, "she stopped by yesterday while you were resting. Said she wants to come stay with us the last few weeks, just to be close when your time comes." The offer brought tears to Margaret's eyes. The midwife's willingness to leave her own home to help with the birth was another sign of the acceptance she'd found in this community, the gradual erosion of the shame and isolation that had defined her life for so long. As autumn arrived and the leaves began to turn, Margaret felt the familiar restlessness that meant the baby's time was approaching. She found herself unable to sit still, compelled to clean and organize and prepare with an urgency that Sam watched with gentle amusement. The nesting instinct, Mrs. Hensley explained when she arrived the third week of September, her medical bag in one hand and a valise of personal belongings in the other. I've seen it in hundreds of women. The baby will come within the next 2 weeks, mark my words. Mrs. Hensley was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with steel-gray hair and capable hands that had brought countless children safely into the world. She moved into the cabin's main room with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to making herself useful wherever she was needed. Her presence brought Margaret a piece she hadn't realized she was missing. Having another woman in the house, someone who understood the mysteries of childbirth and the fears that came with it, made the approaching ordeal seem less daunting. "Tell me about your other pregnancies," Mrs. Hensley said one evening as they sat mending clothes by the fire while Sam worked on harness repairs at the kitchen table. "This is my first," Margaret said, her hand going instinctively to her belly. "Thomas and I were only married 2 years, and for most of that time he was distracted by other things." Mrs. Hensley nodded understanding. She'd lived in Maple Ridge long enough to know about Thomas Hart and his gambling, though she was too kind to speak ill of the dead. "First babies can be unpredictable," she said matter-of-factly. "Sometimes they come quick and easy, sometimes they take their time. But you're young and healthy, and this little one's been active enough to convince me it's strong. I don't anticipate any serious problems." The labor began on a crisp October morning when the cottonwoods were dressed in gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and dying leaves. Margaret woke to a deep, cramping pain that wrapped around her back and sides like a giant fist, squeezing until she could barely breathe. "Sam," she gasped, and he was instantly awake, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "Is it time?" "I think so," Margaret managed as another wave of pain washed over her. "The pains are strong, and they're coming regular." Sam was out of bed and pulling on his clothes before she finished speaking. "I'll get Mrs. Hensley," he said, his voice calm despite the worry she could see in his eyes. "You just rest easy. Everything's going to be fine." Mrs. Hensley took charge with the quiet competence Margaret had come to expect from her. She examined Margaret carefully, timing the contractions and assessing how far the labor had progressed. "Still early yet," she announced with satisfaction. "The baby's positioned well, and you're doing exactly what you should be doing. This might take a while, so try to rest between pains and save your strength for when you really need it." The day passed in a haze of increasing pain and growing urgency. Sam stayed close, holding Margaret's hand through the worst contractions, bringing her water and cool cloths for her forehead. His presence was a constant source of strength, his quiet confidence helping her believe that she could do this impossible thing her body was demanding of her. As evening approached and the pains grew stronger, Margaret found herself thinking about her mother, who had died when Margaret was only 12. She wished desperately for the comfort of a woman who had gone through this experience, who could tell her that the pain was normal, that the fear was temporary, that the reward would be worth all the suffering. "I can't do this," she gasped during a particularly brutal contraction that seemed to go on forever. "It's too much. I can't." "Yes, you can," Sam said firmly, his hand steady on her back as she gripped the bed frame and tried to breathe through the pain. "You're the strongest woman I know, Margaret. You can do anything." Mrs. Hensley looked up from her preparations with approving eyes. "He's right, child. You're built for this, and that baby wants to be born just as much as you want it out. Trust your body. It knows what to do." The final hours of labor were a blur of overwhelming sensation and primal effort that pushed Margaret beyond anything she had imagined herself capable of enduring. But Sam never left her side, his voice a constant anchor in the storm of pain and confusion, reminding her to breathe, to push, to hold on just a little longer. When the baby finally came in the early hours of the morning, sliding into Mrs. Hensley's waiting hands with a rush of fluid and blood, Margaret's first emotion was profound relief that the ordeal was over. Her second was overwhelming love as the midwife cleaned the squalling infant and placed it on her chest. "A daughter," Mrs. Hensley announced with satisfaction. "Perfect in every way, with all her fingers and toes and a good strong voice to let the world know she's arrived." Margaret looked down at the red, wrinkled face of her daughter and felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. The baby's eyes were dark and alert, seeming to focus on Margaret's face with an intensity that took her breath away. "Hello, little one," she whispered, touching the soft cheek with one trembling finger. "I'm your mama." Sam leaned over them both, his face full of wonder as he studied the tiny features. "She's beautiful," he said softly. "Absolutely perfect. Would you like to hold her?" Margaret asked, and Sam nodded, his hands careful and reverent as he took the baby into his arms. The sight of this strong, withered man cradling her newborn daughter with such tenderness brought fresh tears to Margaret's eyes. This was how it should be, she thought. This was what family looked like, not the desperate scramble for survival she'd known with Thomas, but this quiet circle of protection and love. "What will you name her?" Mrs. Hensley asked as she cleaned up from the birth and helped Margaret into a fresh nightgown. Margaret looked at Sam, realizing they'd never discussed names. In all their practical planning for the baby's arrival, they'd somehow never gotten around to the question of what to call their child. "I'd like to name her Sarah," Margaret said slowly, "after your sister, if that's all right with you." Sam's face lit up with surprise and delight. "Sarah would love that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She always said she hoped to have a namesake someday." "Sarah Margaret Garland," Margaret said, testing how the name sounded. "Sarah for new beginnings, Margaret for, well, for me, I suppose." "Sarah Margaret Garland," Sam repeated, smiling down at the baby in his arms. "It's perfect. She's perfect." As Mrs. Hensley packed up her medical supplies and prepared to return to town, she pulled Sam aside for a quiet conversation. Margaret couldn't hear what they were saying, but she saw the midwife's satisfied nod and Sam's relieved expression. Everything went as well as could be hoped, Mrs. Hensley announced as she prepared to leave. "Margaret's young and strong, and she should recover quickly. The baby's healthy as a horse. You send for me if you have any concerns, but I don't expect you'll need to." After the midwife left, Sam settled into the chair beside Margaret's bed, little Sarah sleeping peacefully in his arms. The morning sun streamed through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold and promise. "I can't believe she's really here," Margaret said, still amazed by the tiny miracle they'd created. "After all these months of waiting and worrying, she's actually here and she's perfect." "Just like her mother," Sam said, his eyes warm as they met hers. "You were incredible, Margaret. I've never seen anything braver in my life." The compliment made Margaret's cheeks warm. She'd felt anything but brave during the long hours of labor, but looking back, she supposed there had been a kind of courage in enduring what couldn't be avoided, in trusting her body to do what women had been doing since the beginning of time. "What happens now?" she asked, suddenly aware of how much their lives had changed in the space of a single night. They were no longer just two people making the best of difficult circumstances. They were a family, with all the responsibilities and joys that came with that transformation. "Now we learn how to be parents," Sam said simply. "We take it one day at a time, help each other when we need it, and give this little girl the best life we can manage." As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah stirred in Sam's arms and began to fuss, her tiny mouth rooting around as if searching for something. Margaret felt an immediate response in her body, a fullness and urgency that told her what the baby needed. "I think she's hungry," she said, and Sam carefully transferred the infant to her arms. Nursing came naturally, as if her body knew exactly what to do even though her mind was still catching up to the reality of motherhood. Sarah latched on eagerly, her small hands working against Margaret's chest as she fed. The intimacy of the moment, the three of them connected in this quiet circle of new life, filled Margaret with a contentment she'd never imagined possible. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it, this sense of belonging and purpose that went beyond survival or convenience. As the days passed and they settled into the rhythm of life with a newborn, Margaret was amazed by how naturally Sam took to fatherhood. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor with Sarah when she was fussy, and sang soft lullabies in his surprisingly pleasant voice when the baby couldn't sleep. "You're going to spoil her," Margaret said one evening as she watched him rock Sarah by the fire, the baby's eyes drooping with sleepy contentment. "Good," Sam said without hesitation. "She deserves to be spoiled. She deserves to know she's loved and wanted and precious." The fierce protectiveness in his voice reminded Margaret of their confrontation with Creed outside the church. That same strength that had defended her honor was now focused on protecting their daughter, ensuring that Sarah would grow up knowing her worth regardless of the circumstances of her birth. Word of the baby's arrival spread quickly through the community, and Margaret was touched by the steady stream of visitors who came to offer congratulations and practical help. Mrs. Williams brought a basket of food that would last them a week. Several of Margaret's former students arrived with their mothers, shy but excited to meet their old teacher's baby. Even families Margaret barely knew stopped by with small gifts, a hand-knitted blanket, carved wooden toys, jars of preserved fruit for the winter months ahead. People are being so kind, Margaret marveled as Sam helped her arrange the latest round of gifts. I never expected this much acceptance. They see what I see, Sam said matter-of-factly. A good woman trying to build a good life for her family. That's something people respect, regardless of how it started. The first real test of their new family dynamic came in late November, when an early blizzard swept across the territory with little warning. Margaret woke to howling wind and the peculiar muffled silence that meant heavy snow was falling. When she looked out the window, she could barely see the barn through the swirling white. "Storm's going to be a bad one," Sam said, already pulling on his heavy coat and boots. "I need to get the animals secured and bring in extra wood before it gets worse." Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety as she watched him disappear into the white wall of snow beyond the door. The baby was only 6 weeks old, still completely dependent on her for everything. If something happened to Sam, if he got lost in the storm or injured while doing the necessary work of keeping them all alive, she'd be stranded with no way to get help. But Sam returned safely each time he ventured out, his coat crusted with snow and his cheeks red with cold, but steady and capable as always. He kept the fire burning, the water from freezing, the small space of their cabin warm and secure against the howling wilderness outside. For 3 days, the storm raged with a fury that made the cabin walls shake and the windows rattle in their frames. Margaret spent the time nursing Sarah and watching Sam move efficiently through the tasks that kept them safe, splitting kindling, checking the chimney, rationing their supplies to make sure they'd have enough if the storm lasted longer than expected. On the 4th morning, Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through the windows and the blessed sound of silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow so deep it came halfway up the cabin walls. "We'll need to dig out," Sam said, surveying the white landscape from the doorway. "But we're all safe and sound. That's what matters." As he worked to clear paths to the barn and well, Margaret stood at the window with Sarah in her arms, marveling at how the storm had changed everything. The familiar landscape was now alien and beautiful, sculpted by wind and snow into fantastic shapes that glittered like diamonds in the morning sun. "Your first blizzard, little one," she murmured to the baby, who was studying the bright world beyond the glass with solemn dark eyes. "Hopefully not your last, but certainly the most dramatic." When Sam finally came back inside, stamping snow from his boots and hanging his coat by the fire to dry, Margaret felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly brought her to her knees. This man had chosen to tie his life to hers, to take responsibility for her safety and her child's future. He'd weathered the storm with quiet competence, never complaining about the extra burden their presence created. "Thank you," she said as he settled into his chair by the fire, his hands wrapped around a cup of hot coffee. "For what?" "For everything. For marrying me, for protecting us, for being the kind of man who keeps his word even when it's hard." Sam looked at her for a long moment, his creek-water eyes serious. "Margaret, I need you to understand something. I didn't marry you out of charity or duty. I married you because I saw something in you that I wanted to be part of. These past months, watching you become a mother, seeing how you've made this house into a home, it's been the best time of my life." The simple honesty of his words took Margaret's breath away. She'd spent so long thinking of herself as damaged goods, as someone who'd been lucky to find even this practical arrangement. The idea that Sam might actually value her, might find joy in their partnership, was almost too wonderful to believe. "I love you," she said suddenly, the words surprising them both. "I know that wasn't part of our agreement, but I do. I love you, and I love the life we're building together." Sam's face lit up with a smile that transformed his withered features. "I love you too," he said simply. "Have for months now. I just didn't want to pressure you into feelings you might not be ready for." The admission hung between them like a bridge across the careful distance they'd maintained, an invitation to something deeper than partnership or practical arrangement. Margaret felt her heart expanding with possibilities she'd been afraid to imagine. "What does that mean for us?" she asked, shifting Sarah to one arm so she could reach for Sam's hand. "It means we're not just partners anymore," Sam said, his fingers intertwining with hers. "It means we're a real family, built on choice and love instead of necessity. It means whatever comes next, we face it together, because we want to, not because we have to." Outside, the snow continued to glitter in the afternoon sun, a pristine world waiting to be explored. Inside the warm cabin, Margaret Garland held her husband's hand and her daughter close, surrounded by the love she'd never dared to hope for and the future she'd thought was lost forever. Spring would come again, as it always did, bringing new challenges and new joys. But whatever the seasons brought, they would face them together, a family bound not by duty or circumstance, but by the strongest force of all, love freely given and gratefully received.